to press. Yes, I did that a little bit backwards. And now that it's recording, let's share with our pals on Facebook. So happy that Greg and Jimmy are here to spend an evening with us, talk about trees. Okay, so we're going to go live. All the lights in my room just went out. Uh-oh. Okay, so we are live streaming. Everything's going just a little bit awry, but that's okay. We'll have all the hiccups happen at the beginning with me rather than anyone else. Okay, cool. So enough about that. No more technical difficulties. Welcome, everybody. My name is Caitlin, and I'm the events coordinator here at Square Books in Oxford, Mississippi. So when we are gathered here today to discuss Greg and Peter's fabulous new beautiful book called Our National Forests, and he's joined here by Jimmy Thomas, who I'm sure many of you know and love. But before I pass it off to them, I would like to tell you about a couple of upcoming events happening at the bookstore. I'll try to keep brief. So here we go. Tomorrow, this is for our locals, November 18th, 6 p.m., Thacker Mountain Radio season finale. Where did the time go? It is live at the Lyric Theater at 6 p.m. In order to enter, you need to have either proof of a negative COVID test or proof of full vaccination, or you can wear a mask or both. This week's author is the former chancellor of the University of Mississippi, Dr. Robert Kayat. He'll be reading from his memoir, 60, A Year of Sports, Race, and Politics, which is published by our friends at Nautilus Publishing. Musical guests include classical musician Juan Lee and indie rockers Olympic Music. As always, they'll be joined on stage by Thacker's house band, the Yellow Bushwhackers, and the show's wonderful host, Jim Dees. If you aren't local, you can visit our website for airtimes and links to listen in remotely. All right, and then next month we have three kind of star-studded events. So Thursday, December 2nd at 7 p.m. on Zoom, we are partnering with our friends at Penguin Random House to present a virtual book launch for Dr. Brene Brown's Atlas of the Heart. This is an exclusive event for Square Books readers who pre-order Atlas of the Heart with us. You'll even have the opportunity to submit a question to ask Dr. Brown that she may answer live on the Zoom call. Be a nice Christmas gift too, kind of a surprise. You get the book and you get to watch this event. Then Tuesday, December 7th at 6 p.m. on Crowdcast, we're partnering with our other publishing friends, HarperCollins, to present our pal Ann Patchett in conversation with Amor Tolles. You may know him from Gentleman in Moscow or his new book, The Lincoln Highway, for Ann's charming new essay collection, These Precious Days. We'll have signed first editions. Getting into this event also requires that you purchase a book with us. So it's a little bit of lagniappe. Last one, Friday, December 10th at 7 p.m. This is on a platform called Demio, which is supposed to be kind of a slick, arty version of Zoom. We're partnering with an art book publisher called Faden to present a virtual evening with Annie Leibovitz for her photography book, Wonderland, which just published today. This one's totally free, but we do have a big old stack of Wonderland. It's absolutely beautiful. So swing by the store or visit our website to pick that up or learn more about any of the events that I have just discussed. But enough about them. I would like to tell you a little more about Greg and Jimmy. Greg Peters is a freelance writer based in Missoula, Montana. Before writing full-time as a freelancer, he was a director of communications at the National Forest Foundation, where, among other things, he edited the National Forest Foundation's magazine, Your National Forests. His writing has appeared in National Parks Magazine, High Country News, Down East Magazine, Big Sky Journal, Outside Bozeman, Missoula Independent, and more. And he is now the author of this really beautiful, really thorough, and exceptionally well-priced book. About the host, Jimmy Thomas is the Associate Director for Publications at the Center of the Study at the Center for the Study of Southern Culture. He began work at the center in 2003 as managing editor of the 24-volume New Encyclopedia of Southern Culture. And he is the editor of a variety of works on Southern history and literature, including Conversations with Barry Hannah. An ardent hiker and backpacker, Thomas prefers spending time in the woods and wilderness to that of pretty much any other pastime, other than joining us on Zoom, I'm sure. All right, well, y'all were troopers while I kind of stumbled through all that. Thank you both so much. Those of y'all tuning in at home, please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A function, and I'll come back and moderate those closer to the end of the evening. Thank you both so much. Greg, we're so delighted to have this book on our shelves and so delighted to have you both on our Zoom screens. Okay, y'all have fun.
Oh, thanks, Caitlin. Greg, thanks for writing this book. It's beautiful, it's eloquent, it's a wonderful cultural history of our national forests. And I'm glad you're here with us on Zoom, but you're here with us in Mississippi right now. So welcome to Oxford, Mississippi.
Thanks so much, Jimmy. Those are kind words, and I really appreciate that. It's great to be with you all. Yeah, thanks. I'm excited about tonight.
Yeah. I just, I was excited about this book before Caitlin got in touch with me. I noticed that it was being published and thought that's a book for me. It's
awesome.
And having read it now, I think it's just a really, like I said, it's a great cultural history of the National Forest Service. And I think it's a great way for people to connect with our wild spaces, from the comfort of their armchairs. But I also think it's a call to action, really, and it's a call to awareness. And so I think it's really. I felt like when you were writing this book, that was the ultimate goal, not to just make people let people know about the Forest Service or our national forests, but for them to be engaged in it. So that's something I want to talk about tonight. But I would like to begin by making a distinction clear. And so can you tell us, everybody knows about national parks, right? So what's the difference between national parks and national forests? We can start there if that's
sure.
okay.
Sure, I can definitely talk about that. Well, thank you, Jimmy. I really do appreciate those words. And you, I think, before I answer your question, you're absolutely right. I did want this book to be a call to action in some respects, and whether that's for folks to get engaged in the various public processes that the Forest Service or that they can for our national forests with the Forest Service, or just learn a little bit more about this landscape and learn more about this particular set of public lands. That was really, those were really my goals for the book. So I do appreciate you bringing that up. Before I answer and talk a little bit about the difference between national parks and national forests, I am actually going to share my screen, because one thing that hasn't been mentioned yet that I'm pretty proud of in the book, and I'm going to just kind of open to a random page here, and hopefully it'll demonstrate that. But the book has about 150 photographs in it. And one of the main reasons we wanted to include all those photographs in the book was to demonstrate just how beautiful and how diverse the National Forest System is. And so the slideshow that I'm going to have playing kind of as we talk includes a lot of the photos from the book. I think there's maybe 40 or so, and they'll cycle through as we chat. And so I just really want folks to be able to actually see some of the amazing views and some of the history through some of the photographs that exist on this National Forest System in our national forest. So if you give me just a quick second, I'm going to hit screen share, and then we'll get that going. And then I will start talking about the difference.
Yeah, sorry, I just jumped right into it. I know.
And national forest. No, it's great. I love it. Okay, so this slide, obviously has a map of the national forest system. All those green blobs on there are national forests spread all around the country. The little gold blobs that you see on there are actually national grasslands, which are a component of the national forest system that a lot of folks may not know are part of the forest system. There are 193 million acres of national forests cumulatively across the country, and they stretch from Alaska to Puerto Rico. Alaska has the largest national forest with the Tongass National Forest. That's 17 million acres. Just think about how big that is, 17 million acres. It's absolutely huge. It's 7 times the size of Yellowstone National Park. So I'm already getting into some of the differences between parks and forests. And Puerto Rico has El Yunque National Forest, and you'll see a photo from there as well, which is the country's only tropical forest in the system. There are 20 grasslands. There's one national tallgrass prairie just outside of Chicago, Illinois. That's really a cool story that I tell in the book about kind of restoration and redemption. And I hope Jimmy has a couple questions queued up about that. So yeah, the national forests were set up back in the late 1800s. And they were primarily set up from what was called the public domain lands. And these are lands that were primarily out west, although there were some lands in the east. And they were lands that basically the country took from Native Americans, and the federal government kind of owned them all, as much as the federal government could own land. And beginning in 1891, with the Forest Reserve Act, Congress permitted the president to take different tracts of these public domain lands and set them aside as forest reserves. And so presidents started doing that. And the goal was to prevent illegal timber harvesting, was to prevent wildfires, and was to ensure that some of the things that had been happening in eastern forests and midwestern forests, which at the time, which were entirely privately owned, didn't happen to these forests out west. And that was primarily just deforestation. The forests in the east had been cut over super hard from private timber and railroads and mining and all these different industries that needed trees, and sort of saw the forests as inexhaustible. And that caused a whole bunch of problems. And again, I hope Jimmy has some questions about that. I'm sure he does. So starting in 1891, the president starts pulling aside these forest reserves, but they're never set aside just for preservation. And that's where we really start to see the difference between national parks and national forests. From the outset, national forests were set aside to serve multiple uses. And that word, multiple use, has been codified in public policy subsequent to this time period. The Forest Service didn't actually get established until 1905 under President Teddy Roosevelt. And so there was a little gap there between when the forest reserves were initially created and when the Forest Service itself got started. And the Forest Service is actually a department, or excuse me, an agency under the Department of Agriculture. And that also, I think, speaks to some of the differences between national parks and national forests. National Park Service is managed or is under the Department of Interior. And I think there are two characters who really kind of informed, in large part, the difference in philosophy between the national parks and the national forests. And those two guys are John Muir, who probably a lot of listeners are familiar with, and Gifford Pinchot, who probably some listeners are less familiar with. So John Muir is this American Scottish naturalist, very eloquent writer, and he was just enamored of the natural world. Jimmy and I were chatting a couple of days ago, and I mentioned that I happened to watch a Drunk History episode about the national parks, and they featured John Muir. And I learned a little anecdote in there that I didn't know before. He apparently was injured, and when he woke up after his recovery, he apparently saw the natural world in a different way, and that sort of sparked his lifelong interest in the natural world. And he really felt that we needed to set aside tracts of land and basically leave them be. We needed to preserve them. And preserve them by not engaging in their management at all, just by basically setting them aside. Maybe you could recreate on them, you could hike on them. Of course, this was long before motorized recreation and other things that we have today. But he really felt that these lands needed to be preserved. And that's effectively what national parks do, and what the National Park Service is set up to do. It's set up to preserve these landscapes, wildlife population, views, recreation opportunities. Meanwhile, a contemporary of Muir's, Gifford Pinchot, he felt that that public lands could be managed, and that with the right training and the right education, that foresters could go out there and they could improve the forests, they could harvest trees, they could maintain water supplies, and they could effectively take natural resources out of the forests, but also still keep them relatively intact and sustainable. And this philosophy is summed up in a quote that he basically put in a letter to early forest rangers back in 1905, instructing them on exactly how they should make decisions. And I'm going to maybe paraphrase it a little bit, but effectively the quote is, when conflicting interests need to be reconciled, the answer should always be derived from this concept of the greatest good for the greatest number in the long run. And so this notion kind of came to represent what lowercase c conservation means. And so you've got our national parks that were set up for preservation, basically following that ethos of Muir. And then you've got national forests that were set up for conservation, following that ethos of Gifford Pinchot. And he actually borrowed that greatest good concept from an English philosopher named Jeremy Bentham, who created the concept of utilitarianism, which is basically that something's moral if it benefits the most people that it can. And that was really what Pinchot wanted for the national forests. And that concept, that capacity to provide multiple uses that benefit the greatest number of people over the long term, really gets at that multiple use concept that national forests still are managed for today. So that's just sort of a little bit on the background and how national parks and national forests got established. A little more current, if you'll indulge me to keep talking about this for a little bit longer, are just some basic differences in land size and in, I would say, recreational opportunities. So the national park system is about, I think it's about 85 million acres. And as I mentioned earlier, the national forest system is 193 million acres. So the national park system is really only about half the size, a little less than, of the national forest system. So already you've got a pretty massive difference in just the extent of the landscape that these two agencies manage and these two types of public lands represent. There are 160,000 miles of trails on national forests, which just blows my mind. And today's National Hiking Day, actually. And while unfortunately neither Jimmy or I were able to go out for a hike today, I hope some of you were, it is National Hiking Day. And so it's a great day to kind of bring up that statistic. Of that 160,000 miles on national forests of trails, 98,000, almost 100,000 miles of those are non-motorized. And, I've done some backpacking in my day. And I think if you try and pull off a 10 or 15 mile day backpacking, that's a huge day, and your feet are tired and sore. You probably got blisters, your shoulders are hurting. 100,000 miles exist. You could do that thousands of times and still not quite get the full extent of the trails in national forests. 31,000 miles of those trails are in wilderness areas, designated wilderness areas, where you're not going to encounter a mountain bike, you're not going to encounter an ATV or any other kind of vehicle. By contrast, the national park system has about 12,000 miles of trail, as of a stat in 2008 that I could find. So you really start to see some of the differences in just the scope and the size and the recreation opportunities on these places. And today, I think we know of national parks as America's best idea. They've got documentaries, they've got Ken Burns, there's all this all these Instagram posts, there's all this media about national parks, and there's relatively little about national forests. And so that was getting back to kind of the top of the conversation. That was one reason that I really wanted to write a book about national forests in particular. I think they're really important, and I think they provide an immense value for the US and for our citizens, but they just don't get all the love that national forests get. So I wanted to, or excuse me, that national parks get. So I wanted to take a stab at providing some of that love on my own. So anyway, yeah, I hope that helps shed a little bit of light on the difference, and I could talk about it some more, but I'm sure you've got lots of other questions, and I'm excited to hear what they are.
Well, yeah, as I was reading this book, I did keep thinking about Ken Burns and how he really brought national parks to national attention. And as I was reading this book, I couldn't help, and this may or may not be a compliment, but I kept thinking how you were kind of the Ken Burns now of national forests. You know, not only with this book, but the work you've done in the past. You know, your work with the National Forest Foundation, and just bringing all this awareness to national forests, which we really do take for granted. I suppose we take it for granted. We travel through them in ways that we don't travel through national parks. You can drive out Highway 30 here and drive right through the middle of the Holly Springs National Forest. And while there are signs there, we kind of take them for granted that they are public lands, and they're huge swaths of land. As a matter of fact, Mississippi has 6 national forests. I won't try to remember all of them, but that's more than any other state east of the Mississippi River. And one thing I wanted to ask you, and I was going to ask later, but I think I'll ask it now, is what do you infer from that, Greg, that this number of, you know, Mississippi is a rural place, it's a rural state, so we do have a lot of wild lands out there. But yeah, so we've got so much for a state our size. What can you infer from that?
Well, Mississippi is not a small state either. It is a pretty big state, and particularly in the east, probably one of the larger, so I don't have the stats at my fingertips. So I think that's a great question. It gives me an opportunity to talk a little bit about eastern forests in general, and sort of when they came to be. So I talked earlier about the creation of forests from the public domain out west. Eastern forests came about through a very different process, a process that started in 1911 through the Weeks Act, which is named after a congressperson from Massachusetts, though he was originally from New Hampshire, a guy named John Weeks. And I had mentioned earlier as well that in the East, most of the land, pretty much all the land, was privately owned. And timber practices at the time had really just deforested so much of the landscape. And what happened as a result of that was that there were floods and water pollution that was degrading and causing real issues for these downstream communities that live downstream from these forested watersheds. And so Weeks found a way to craft a law that allowed the federal government to purchase private lands, these cut over lands that were in these watersheds, and effectively bring them into the federal estate and provide the Forest Service an opportunity to restore them so that those downstream communities could benefit from having clean, healthy water, which they didn't have because those forests had been so cut over. And so I don't know the history specifically of a lot of the forests in Mississippi, but I'm guessing that there were some forestry practices that probably created some issues for some of those downstream communities. And when the Forest Service and the federal government generally started investigating which lands it could purchase in the East to add to the forest system, there were a lot of those lands in Mississippi that had willing sellers, and where those reforestation and restoration efforts that the Forest Service was engaging in would benefit those downstream communities. And that connection between water and forests has been known by human civilization for millennia. There are stories of ancient Greece and other ancient cities who cut trees in their upper watersheds, and they had, pollution and other water control issues. So it's not a new story, but it's one that we seem to perpetually forget, and that we need to keep being reminded of. And so I think in this country, we were reminded of this back in the early 1900s. And I think today still the Forest Service wrestles with the need to provide water to these downstream communities, with the need to, or the desire, or however you want to frame it, with the opportunity to harvest trees from these landscapes as well. And so I would guess a lot of the history of those Mississippi national forests comes from those degraded water supplies and the opportunity to restore those upper higher elevation watersheds back to healthy functioning forests, which then trap rainwater, and allow that to percolate into the ground, recharge aquifers, recharge groundwater supplies. They keep streams cool and shaded so that fish can survive and other aquatic species, and they prevent flooding as well. When there aren't trees, all that rain just runs straight into the creeks and the rivers, brings a lot of sediment and pollution with it, and then it just goes downstream and causes all sorts of problems. So yeah, I think that history is probably connected there. And I would argue you guys are a pretty fortunate state to have such amazing access to more than 1 million acres of public lands. In the East, public lands of that size are pretty rare. And so, I would really encourage folks to get out and explore those areas if they haven't had the chance yet.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to get back to that. I want to get back to that too. That's something that's a big question of mine. But I was also wondering, so we've got, and I don't know when these national forests were established. I don't know that if they were established all in one fell swoop or not. But are our national forests growing? How are the borders established, and do they grow and shrink? How often are we establishing new national forests, or like Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante during the Trump administration, are they shrinking? Are they in danger? I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm surprised a lot of folks have asked that in the various interviews that I've been doing. I hadn't really anticipated that to be something that folks were interested in. So actually, this slide right here that we're seeing, Medewin, is the National Tallgrass Prairie that's outside of Chicago that I mentioned, and it's probably the most recent addition to the National Forest System. So, in some respects, the forest system is growing. Individual forests probably aren't growing much. What does happen occasionally, and this is in part because of some of the land ownership patterns out west and probably down south as well, probably even more so, and in the east, there are private inholdings within national forests that had been there before the boundaries of that forest were drawn originally. And so sometimes the Forest Service works with those landowners to do land swaps. So if there's a piece of private land that's completely surrounded by national forests, it may be somewhat inaccessible to that owner, or the Forest Service may want to try to obtain ownership of that so that they can better manage that landscape as part of the broader whole. So they'll often do these forest swaps or these land swaps where they'll find another parcel that's sort of equivalent ecologically or whatever, but maybe has better access because it's on the edge of the forest, and they'll swap those lands with the current landowner. So that does happen. I don't know of any examples where the forests are shrinking due to, a presidential administration or a proclamation or something like that. And I think that's largely due to the fact that Congress really has the power to create public lands. The president doesn't necessarily have that power. What the president can do is layer on a new management concept to a set of already existing public lands. And so that's what we saw with Bears Ears. President Obama said, okay, all this BLM land, Bureau of Land Management land, that was already public land, he wanted it to, and others wanted it to be managed a little bit differently. So he layered on top of that a national monument designation that prescribed the different uses of that land. President Trump came in and said, I'm going to reduce that national monument designation, but it didn't reduce the amount of BLM land that was there either prior to Obama or post-Obama. It just reduced the size of the layer that the president imposed on that particular set of public lands. And that's a similar thing we see with wilderness, in that Congress is the only entity that can create new wilderness, and they do that from existing public lands. That's not something a president can just do unilaterally. There is a long history, particularly with the Park Service, of private donors donating land to the federal government. And so the federal estate can grow, but it's through private folks buying land. And this happened pretty recently up in Maine, where I am from, where a woman named Roxanne Quimby, who made a bunch of money through Burt's Bees, which some folks probably are familiar with, she bought a lot of land near a state park in Maine, and then donated that to the federal government. And President Obama then, or the federal government, accepted that land, brought it into the federal estate, and then Obama designated that land as Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument. So it was purchased privately, was donated to the federal government, and then Obama layered a management system on that land that through the Antiquities Act and his ability to create a national monument. So despite sort of the history of the federal government purchasing land from private landowners to add to the federal estate, that doesn't happen that much anymore, though private owners can donate land. And I don't think the national forests are really reducing. And that story of Medewin is pretty interesting. That was already federal land that the Department of Defense actually owned. There was a huge munitions factory in this 20,000 acre parcel that was created after World War II or during World War II to make TNT and bombs that the Defense Department ran until after Vietnam. Then they decided that they didn't want it anymore. And so they gave it to the Forest Service effectively. And the Forest Service started to restore this military industrial complex into a tall grass prairie. So there are, again, examples where the forest system might be growing, whether through private donations or donations through land transfers from other federal agencies, other federal entities that don't need that land anymore. It was a long-winded answer to what seems like a straightforward question.
Well, it's good news that they're not going away.
No,
They're not shrinking. You know, one of the things that you mentioned twice in the book that really struck me, and I think this is kind of the core of the book. And I do want to get to some of the stories that you tell, because you do tell stories of individuals and individual groups who are doing great work out there. But, and this is a kind of a big philosophical question, but you say that our national forests are mirrors of our society. And if you kind of elaborate on that a little bit,
sure.
That'd be great. Thanks.
Excuse me. My wife just got home and scared the dog. He's my companion here, but now he's downstairs. Sorry about that. Yeah, other folks have asked me about that as well. So one thing I discovered in the research for this book that I think is really interesting, a lot of the same debates about how we use natural resources on these public lands that we own are the same now as they were 100 or 150 years ago. And I think those debates mirror how our society approaches the natural world. Do we take John Muir's concept of preservation of the natural world and a sort of a hands-off approach? Do we leave the trees? Do we leave the rivers and the fish and the wildlife and just sort of let them do their thing? Maybe we walk through a little bit. Or do we wrest some economic value out of that through timber harvesting or mining or whatever it might be? And I think both of those have their place in American society. I think, personally, I'd probably rather us get as much oil as we can domestically than from regimes that don't, that don't safeguard the environment in the way that we do here, even though we still produce oil. Or we harvest timber from places in a sustainable way instead of importing timber from places where it's harvested unsustainably. So I think a lot of the debates about how we manage the natural world, and particularly those natural resources, have been fairly consistent over time. And I think they mirror our general society's approach to natural spaces and to the natural world. So that's one element of what I think, or what I meant by that quote. I also think that we elect political leaders, to represent our values. And so when we elect political leaders who feel like natural resource extraction is the best and highest use of the land, then that gets mirrored into how those lands are utilized. When we elect leaders who feel like conservation and other values are the highest use of that land, that gets mirrored into how those lands are managed. So I think it works on a couple of levels. One, I think just the general debate about the natural world, how we use it, how we coexist with it, are we part of it, are we separate from it? I think that the policies and the practices and the projects that happen on public lands sort of mirror that debate. And I think generally at a higher level, the politicians that we elect also mirror our desires, or should at least, and represent our desires. And then the last piece, I think, is this is a little more social, but one chapter I have in the book is about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And for a long time, the outdoor recreation space, public lands, they weren't particularly accessible to Americans of color, and to Americans who didn't have the socioeconomic means to get out on those lands. And so you see that disadvantage baked into access to public lands, that we see baked into access to credit, into access to housing, into access to jobs and education, and all these other things in our society that systemic racism and other issues have caused. So I think there's a lot of ways that that our national forests mirror our society, and I think it's particularly true for national forests because of those multiple uses. You know, our national parks mirror just one element of that debate about the natural world. They mirror that preservation ethos, because they're not used for timber harvesting, they're not used for other things, but our national forests are used for so many different things. They do really mirror all of those other challenges and debates that we have in society.
Cool. Yeah. I think some of those debates are evolving. Particularly, I forget what chapter it is. I think it's chapter 9, where you do discuss access and diversity. And again, I think this is one of the great qualities of this book, is that it's not a straight history of the national forest system, but that you tackle a number of different issues from its origins and its genesis. But then you also talk about things that are issues that are contemporary, that are increasingly, there's an increasing awareness. And so you talk not only about racial diversity, but gender diversity, not only in the forests, but in the forest system, or the Forest Service, I should say. Mm-hmm. And there you talked about how, there goes my dog now. But you talked about leadership, how leadership has evolved in the National Forest Service. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely.
How that has evolved.
And actually, that's a great question, and a timely one, because right now, as of about 2 months ago, for the first time ever, there's an African American chief of the Forest Service. Randy Moore was just appointed a couple months ago, and that is a groundbreaking appointment for sure. It was, I think it's 1976 was like the first African American forest ranger ever in the forest system. So it took 70 years to get the first African American ranger, and then it took another 50 years to get the first African American chief of the Forest Service. And there have been 2 women who have been chiefs of the Forest Service as well in the past, including Mr. Moore's predecessor. So I think on an institutional level, I think the Forest Service is changing in a lot of ways, and doing so intentionally and with purpose. And I think that's great. I think the appointment of Randy Moore has, some broader societal impacts. It allows folks who might not have seen themselves in a career in natural resources realize that they can rise to the highest, level of one of the biggest federal agencies in the country. And I think that's huge. I mean, I think that's kind of similar. It's a much bigger scale and maybe a bigger representation, but it's similar to some of the stories that I tell in that chapter about just how the outdoor industry has represented its constituents and the folks that participate in outdoor recreation. Until 4 or 5 years ago, you open an REI catalog or a Cabela's catalog or a Bass Pro Shops catalog, and it was almost exclusively white fit people. And there were women in there, but only because they were trying to sell women's clothes and women's gear, or not maybe only because, but because they were trying to sell women's clothes and women's gear. That has shifted radically in the last 5 years, I would say. And now when you open an REI or a Cabela's catalog, it's much more diverse than it used to be. Right now there's actually, or next year actually, there's going to be the first ever all African-American expedition up Everest, which is huge. And one of the stories I tell in that chapter is of the first all African-American expedition up Denali. Now, Denali's in Denali National Park, not in a forest, but it served as a really great example of just how long it took for that even to be a thing. I think that happened in 2015. So it wasn't that long ago that the first all African-American expedition up Denali actually occurred. And I use a quote of one of the women who was on that expedition. And she said specifically in, I think, a National Geographic interview that she wanted to do that so that little brown girls could see themselves in the mountains, in the exact position that she was in. So, it's really providing those opportunities for young people to see themselves in these places, both in leadership positions in the Forest Service and just in these outdoor spaces. And I think that tide is turning in a big way, and I'm really heartened by that, because at the end of the day, to sort of circle back a little bit to how we started, or how you, I really appreciate, pointed out that this book is a call to action. I think we need a broader constituency of people engaged in our public lands, and I don't care what size, shape, or color they are, or sex they are. We just need more people who give a damn about these places. And so I think the broader we can cast that net, the bigger tent we can build, whatever analogy you want to use, I think we're better off. Now there might be some overuse issues and some struggles as we're bringing those folks into the fold, so to speak, or getting them out into these places where they may not have the experience that some of us have. But those of us who've been in these places, who've had the privilege to be out there, it's incumbent on us to help others, whether they look like us or not, learn those skills, become comfortable in these places, and become engaged in their management into the future. Otherwise, I think we could be in a world of hurt.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree. And this is one thing I wanted to kind of come back to, and I think you're absolutely right, and it's really important that if you don't know anything about these public spaces, these public lands, you're not apt to care much about them or what happens to them.
Correct.
And I believe that, and I think that's super important. It's essential. It's not just important, it's essential. At the same time, as somebody who spends a lot of time in the woods, I notice, and you mentioned this, writing this book during a pandemic, that the outdoor spaces have become increasingly important to us as safe spaces. Ironically, you make this point that it is rather ironic that the outdoors have become the safe space, that the indoors are the places that we fear now. So getting out into the wilderness, or just out into a trail out here, whirlpool trails, they're packed now. So I guess that's where I'm going with this, is that some of these wild places are becoming less wild in the sense that there are more people there. And as we bring more people to these spaces, we bring more of our things, and more of our built environment happens in these places. Places like Yosemite, you can't drive around in. You can't get there. I worked in Yosemite is back in 1991. And even then we were complaining that you should have to hike in if you wanted to go up, Half Dome or wherever, or go see, Yosemite Falls. So I think there is a tension there between encouraging people to get out more and wanting these places to be wilderness. And I absolutely understand that everyone should have access to be able to experience the wild. Absolutely. But there is that tension there that some of us want us to earn it. And I don't think that's fair. even if that's a way a lot of people feel, because it has gotten crowded. Zion is, for example, you can no longer drive into Zion National Park, not national, it's not national forest, but you can no longer bring a car into areas of Zion. So that's happening. So how do we deal with that, with the overcrowding and wanting people to be there?
That's a huge question. And I'm not a recreational manager. There are professionals who do this kind of thing. There are degrees devoted to this kind of thing. But I think from a philosophical standpoint, and from a national forest standpoint, I can try to answer it a little bit, at least. It actually, I'm going to circle back to your first question again. Difference between national forests and national parks. So, when you go to a national park, you go through an entrance gate. You meet a ranger, or at least you got to pay, for your weekday pass or your day pass. They give you the brochure. They, instruct you maybe a little bit on where to go and what you might be able to do. I don't know of a single entrance gate into a national forest. You go to a trailhead, you park. If you have to pay a parking fee, you pay that parking fee, I hope. And then you head off and you do your thing. There are a few places in national forests where you do have to get a permit that are really popular, or that are wilderness areas, where solitude is one of the wilderness characteristics that the agency has to manage for. So they have to manage to try to reduce the number of people that want to be in that place so that you can be there and experience some level of solitude. So national forests are pretty free in that respect. You can just kind of head out and do what you want to do, which I think is a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing in that it kind of lowercase d democratizes access to the outdoors. It's less expensive. You don't feel like you can't step off the pavement onto the grass, even though you're in a national you're in this beautiful wild place, which you do kind of feel like in some national parks. And Yellowstone, for example, you don't want to step off some of those boardwalks because you might burn to death. But there are other places where it's just so heavily regulated, and you almost feel like you're just on this like conveyor belt of tourism that takes you through arches or takes you through Zion or whatever it is. National forests aren't like that, and so I think it's incumbent on, and the Forest Service certainly thinks it's incumbent on the users to work with each other to build those skills so that new users who come to these places recognize that, oh man, this trailhead is super crowded. But you know what? If I drive another couple miles up the road, there's probably a trailhead that's going to be less crowded, and I can go to that one. Am I going to get that waterfall view that I was so hoping for? Not this day, but maybe I can come back some other time and get that. But I'm going to get out and I'm going to be able to hike and enjoy nature and all that kind of stuff. So I think there are responsibilities that we have both as individuals and as members of a broader community to build those skill sets, to build some of those behaviors, and encourage folks to, one, get out, but get out responsibly, and to reduce their impacts as much as they can. And certainly the Forest Service manages recreation with that notion in mind. I think when I asked in the recreation chapter, I had a chance to chat with a ranger in Colorado. I asked him what the biggest problem he saw from recreation, and his answer was human poop. Because in Colorado, we've got a lot of peaks that are over 14,000 feet high. These are alpine zones. You just spend 6 hours hiking up to an alpine zone and you got to go to the bathroom. There's no trees. There's no soil to bury your waste in. It's just all rocks. It's all alpine tundra, basically, with these little fragile plants. And so people go to the bathroom and they don't know how to do that correctly. They don't bring wag bags that you can use to collect your waste and bring it out with you. They leave their toilet paper, which is, I think, just mind-blowing and disgusting and just wrong on so many levels, but whatever. They just don't know. They don't know. And so I think it's incumbent on us to have some patience, those of us who have some more experience, to have some patience with folks that may not know, to not assume that they're doing it intentionally or that they're being malicious, but that they just probably don't know. And if you can find a diplomatic way to address that with them, great. If you can't, then don't get in a fight. So again, long-winded answer. I'm pretty good at those, but it's a big question, and one that I don't have a lot of answers to, except that I think we all have to work together collaboratively to improve how we access and utilize these resources.
Yeah, I think that is a great answer. So with books like this, I think you're really doing a great job of educating people on what that responsibility is in maintaining these public lands. We have to remember these are public lands. They are all of our lands, and we're sharing them, and that we do need to be responsible citizens, responsible hikers, responsible consumers of, we are consuming no matter, you go into the wild, there is a consumption happening. So yeah, so I don't know, and Caitlin will let us know how much longer we've got. I could do this for hours. But what is it like? What do you see as, so we are preserving and conserving with the national forests. What do you consider the biggest threat to national forests and public lands in America?
Well,
sorry, Caitlin.
Yeah, no, so that maybe this will be our last question, Jimmy, because I think we've got just 10 minutes or so left, and I do want to make sure we can answer a couple questions. I want to amend one thing you just mentioned real quickly, and then I'll answer your question. Not only are we sharing these resources with each other currently, but we are sharing them with the future. And I think that's a really important point. They're not making more land. We only have as much land as we have. And so what we decide to do with that land has impacts far down the line. It's like that I think it's Chief Seattle quote, we think about our decisions with 7 generations in mind. If it's not Chief Seattle, I apologize, but there's that that notion in indigenous cultures that there's the future that we have to think about. And I think that's something that our public lands provide us with an opportunity to do. So I wanted to add that in. I think there are 2 big challenges. One is an external challenge that is probably the existential challenge of our generation and the next generation. That's obviously climate change, how that is impacting just the ecology of these places, wildfires, snowfall, water, all those things. So that's a huge issue that the Forest Service has to wrestle with. And the second thing I think we talked about a little bit earlier, that is a disengaged citizenry, a citizenry that just doesn't know about these landscapes, doesn't care about them, doesn't understand that they have an opportunity to participate in them, to voice their opinions, to comment in different ways. And so I think those are the two big threats: climate change, and I guess I would say apathy, maybe, or just, I don't want to say ignorance, because I think that's not quite the right word, but just a lack of knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Caitlin, do we have some questions? I hope so.
What do you think?
We do. Oh, Jimmy, you first.
No, you.
Okay, so we have a few questions. This has been really wonderful. Thank you so much. I've learned so much. And the lack of knowledge is a little less lacking now, thanks to y'all. Okay, so this is a fun one, especially since we've had some 4-legged friends on the Zoom call. Gail would like to know, are dogs welcome in national forests?
2 thumbs up. Yes, Gail, they are. They're welcome on trails. They're welcome just about anywhere. There probably are some areas, where you got to keep them on a leash for a little while or that sort of thing. But yes, dogs are absolutely welcome. That's another big difference between national forests and national parks, and one that I deeply appreciate, because I love taking my dog out on the forest for sure.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite things about visiting Bankhead National Forest in Alabama. There's always cute dogs running around. Okay, so we've got some more. Do we need more rangers to monitor and instruct on behavior in forests? Parentheses, poop, question mark.
Yes, although the rangers may disagree a little bit in terms of what their role is. I do think that the in general, the Forest Service is understaffed, under-resourced, and charged with an incredibly complicated mission. So yes, we need more rangers, we need more ologists, biologists, all these kinds of folk, hydrologists. The Forest Service just needs, I think, a lot more funding, and that's dependent on the politicians that we elect and whether or not they decide to give these public land management agencies the resources that they need. So yes, the Forest Service would deflect, I think, and this is the answer that this particular ranger gave me when I was talking with him about the poop issue. They want the recreation groups, the stakeholders, the climbing groups, the hiking groups, they want those folks to do that education on their behalf. And part of that stems from, if they impose a regulation on a national forest that you have to carry a wag bag, I would argue that probably half the people that go to that trailhead to hike that mountain don't know they're on that national forest necessarily. They just know they're going to hike a mountain wherever it is. So they don't know to even go to the Forest Service's website and see what the regulations are. So, they can post signs and all sorts of things and people just don't see them, for sure. I've been guilty of that before.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, that it's more about just, I feel like, if folks knew, if you're taking the time to go spend time in a national forest, and you probably care about it, you just didn't know. So, okay, let's see. Oh, here's one. This is from Angela. She submitted this one in the chat, so I'll be able to show it to the audience. But she says, wonderful talk. Thank you both. She has a question about the infrastructure bill that was just enacted and its likely impact on the National Forest Service. Was new money allocated, or is it known yet?
I was wondering about that too. That was one of my questions.
That is a good question. I do not know the answer to that. Other people might know it, so it might be known. I don't know it. However, just at the tail end of the Trump administration, the Great American Outdoors Act was passed, and that was specifically to fund improvements and infrastructure improvements on public lands, and the Forest Service is getting a lot of that money. And another great thing that happened was the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is a fund that is set up to take offshore oil and gas drilling taxes and royalties and put them into public land acquisitions. Actually, Jimmy, I should have mentioned this when you asked me if things are growing. The Land and Water Conservation Fund does provide funding to state, federal, and local entities to purchase either additional land and add it to their portfolio, or to purchase the rights for people to access public land that might be cut off by private land in between. And so that has finally been fully funded. It was a battle to even get that whole concept fully funded. And so there are two really great examples recently of some additional funding going to these public land management agencies that I think are really heartening.
It's good news.
Yes, definitely. It's nice to hear some good news. Okay. Oh, this is one that I was going to ask, but and I would love to hear the answer from both of y'all. What is your favorite forest?
All right, Jimmy, you go first.
That's almost impossible to answer. I'm in the Holly Springs National Forest more than any other, but that's because we're in such close proximity to it. But I love it. It's beautiful this time of the year. Puskus Lake is in the middle of it, and it is secluded. It's a 3-mile gravel road down to it, and the foliage reflecting off of that lake, and there's no one else around, and there are bald eagles crying in the distance. It's just beautiful, and it's just such beautiful solitude. And if someone else is out there, it's okay too. But it's beautiful. But Caitlin, I know you and I have talked about this, and the William P. Bankhead National Forest over in Alabama is incredibly wild. It is dense woods, and I feel like there's two different. I feel like woods and forests are kind of different. Woods are kind of dark and creepy, and forests are, big, majestic, giant trees. And but that one's a great one too. The Sipsey Wilderness, which we haven't talked about.
Yes,
capital W Wilderness is right in the middle of it. I think it's the largest oak. is it, I don't know, Caitlin, you'll correct me, but I think it's the largest oak tree east of the Mississippi is in the Sipsey Wilderness.
Oh, I wouldn't know. I just know that I really love being there,
Yeah,
communing
it's
with
great.
the trees.
Yeah.
Put a link to Sipsey if anyone's interested. It's beautiful. Okay, Greg.
So you probably saw me cycling through some of these photos a little bit quickly. It's because I wanted to bring up this particular photo, which I was fortunate enough to be able to capture a couple of summers ago. This is on the Bitterroot National Forest, which is just south of Missoula. So I'm defaulting a little bit to the same tactic that Jimmy took. Proximity has really helped me determine which is my favorite national forest. I'm so fortunate to spend a lot of time on this particular national forest, and also the Lolo that is just right north of town, north and east and west and everywhere. Missoula is an incredible town if you like access to public lands. We're completely surrounded by national forests, wilderness areas, and so the Bitterroot and the Lolo are my two favorites. But there's so many out there. They're so different. I really want to get to the Superior. I really want to check out the Boundary Waters Canoe Wilderness area. I love the Southeast. I grew up vacationing down in South Carolina, and I spent some time in Georgia, and I just love that zone. I love those forests. So I would love to get down and check out, take Jimmy up on his offer to show me around a little bit. That would be a lot of fun.
Yes, please. That'd be great. I'd love that. What about you, Caitlin? What's your favorite national forest?
I mean, I'm like admittedly pretty indoorsy. That's why I work at a bookstore. But I do love getting to visit Sipsey. I only get to do it like a couple of times a year, but it's so fun. We have like our own little spot, and it's just really beautiful. And I always feel better when I have to kind of return to the real world. And yeah, I haven't spent a whole lot of time in Holly Springs. I should maybe try to change that before it's too cold.
There's some trails out there that are not. There's some trails out there that are just yet to be discovered by a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that was one thing. I don't know how much time we've got left, but I did want to ask, and maybe Greg, you can answer this, and maybe not. But if I wanted to go out to Holly Springs National Forest or Delta National Forest or wherever, and I wanted to blaze a trail, I think about this all the time. If I wanted to blaze a trail and create a new trail or a new trail system, could I do that in the national forests, or are there some sort of regulations? I mean, I'm not going to cut down trees or anything, but could I establish a trail somehow, or get a crew to help me establish a trail? How does that work?
That's a good question. I think generally speaking, no is the short answer.
Okay, I won't tell anybody. I'll just.
But you can certainly work with a group to approach the Forest Service and say, hey, we think this place would be a great for a trail or a trail network, and they might say, okay, great, if you've got the resources and the knowledge and you can build the trails to our standards so that they don't erode and foul waterways, etc., then you probably would be allowed to do that. The challenge is the resource concerns. You're a professor, you're not a professional trail builder, and so you just may not know how to build that trail in the right way that it doesn't cause resource issues down the line. But I think they're open to additional trails, and there are a lot of trails that have been built, guerrilla trails that have been built that have then become incorporated into the trail system in a lot of places, but it's generally frowned upon. I don't think they're going to take you to court, but they're not gonna give you 2 thumbs up and look the other way either, unless you do it through a formal process.
Yeah, well, I'll consider that. Let's take that under advisement.
Exhibit A.
Really?
Lawsuit.
Yeah.
So like I realize this is like a little bit cheesy, but something that like we're so fortunate that a lot of our readers are really like wonderful kind of nature readers. So we sell a lot of books about trees and forests, and we always make this like stupid joke about how it's like just a little ironic to be like buying a book about trees, but there is no irony for this one because it's got I meant to compliment you on this. I don't know if this is you or Timber Press. I'm not sure if you can read that, but this paper is sourced from responsible sources. Well done, Greg. Well done, Timber Press. And I mean, Greg wasn't joking about the photographs. They're beautiful and just like great color. The book smells extra good. Which, I mean, really it does. And he was kind enough to send us these wonderful little book plates, our kind of COVID workaround for signed copies.
I want one, Greg. Send me one.
I might have a couple spare book plates for you, but I do kind of want to remind folks that we can't have virtual, in-person, hybrid, or whatever else we come up with next author events without your support. So if you haven't already picked up our National Forest, I've got a big, beautiful stack at Square Books. You can order online at squarebooks.com or swing by and see us or give us a call. I think this is a fabulous holiday gift. Again, like I know you're not supposed to judge a book by its cover or like, you know, the pictures and all the trimmings, but for $29.95, it's really quite the accomplishment. So good on Timber Press and good on you, Greg. This really has been such a treat. I'm so glad you both took some time out of the middle of your week to talk with us and share your insight and passion on our most important public lands. But I'll give you all the last word and then I'll push that red button. It's always hard to say goodbye.
Oh, well, Greg, I really appreciate this. I'm honored that Caitlin asked me to do this. I was really excited from the moment I got that email from her. And congratulations on this book. It's beautiful. Everybody go buy it. Perfect Christmas present. It's really a wonderful book. We just scratched the surface. There's so much to talk about with this book. So congratulations, Greg, and thanks.
Oh, thank you all so much. This was really a lot of fun, Jimmy. I appreciate you taking the time to do this. We don't know each other before right now, and it was really cool that you were willing to join me for this. Thank you all for joining us as well, and to Caitlin for organizing this, and to Square Books for, as Jimmy said, being one of the coolest independent bookstores in the country. I was honored. Some of those names you mentioned, Caitlin, that are upcoming, I feel like I'm in very good company. I'm a little humbled by some of those authors that you mentioned that are upcoming, and I might try to jot a couple of those down on my own calendar and join. So thank you all so much.
Holler. Yeah, thank you all, everybody who joined us. It's been so wonderful. Congrats again, Greg. I will make this a goofy love fest that'll last for hours. So I'm just gonna rip off the Band-Aid and say goodbye. So thank you all so much.
Thanks,
Hey,
Jimmy.
everybody. Good to see you, Greg.